Many folks spend their entire lives trying to avoid thinking about what comes after death. Others believe it's too late to ponder such things. But what if I told you that one of the greatest researchers of the human soul dedicated decades to investigating precisely what happens after the last breath? Dr. Stevenson, a psychiatrist, studied thousands of cases of children who remembered past lives in vivid detail. This video isn't an opinion or a belief. It's a direct invitation for you to listen carefully to content that was considered too controversial for television at the time. An interview few have had access to, one that could completely change how you view life, death, and the meaning of existence. If you've lost someone or feel you're approaching an important point in your journey, what will be said here might offer a new understanding of everything. Stevenson wasn't looking to convince anyone. He was a scientist, accustomed to hearing the voices of human suffering. In his clinical practice, he began to find patterns in the accounts of young children who claimed to have lived another life. The coincidences were numerous, but what made him delve deep into this field was the sheer amount of specific information these children provided. They knew names of villages, relatives, accidents, and professions they couldn't possibly have known. Some spoke languages they had never heard. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now is the perfect time to do so and leave a like. What's coming requires calm, discernment, and an open mind. Stevenson didn't offer ready answers, but he raised questions so unsettling that, often, it was the silence of authorities that drew the most attention. In one of the most impressive cases, a 3-year-old girl in India claimed to have been a man who died by murder. She recognized locations, described the altercation in detail, and led researchers to the old home. Most disconcerting was that the man's family confirmed everything. Even birthmarks on the child's body matched fatal injuries recorded on that other man's death certificate. And this didn't happen just once or twice. There were over 2,000 documented cases with this level of precision. Stevenson himself visited families, conducted cross-interviews, and independently verified the data. His methodology was praised by doctors and lawyers who didn't believe in reincarnation, but respected his rigorous approach. He never claimed that reincarnation was an absolute truth, but the evidence he gathered left a legitimate doubt even among the most skeptical. The question he posed was simple: how to explain this without considering that consciousness survives death? Stevenson used to say that our minds are not yet capable of fully understanding what consciousness is. For him, dying might not be the end, but merely a transition. And when someone who has spent a lifetime hearing stories of loss, fears, and such vivid memories says this with seriousness, perhaps it's time to listen. The interview you are about to hear shows Stevenson with a slow but firm voice. He doesn't try to persuade. He simply shares what he saw, what he documented, and what impressed him. For a long time, this material was kept out of public reach. Some universities refused to release the data, while others simply archived the research without comment. But Stevenson continued. Even after his retirement, he maintained his commitment to publishing each new case with the utmost clarity. For him, the important thing was not to prove reincarnation, but to open a space for it to be considered as a legitimate hypothesis. Many older adults around the world began to report personal experiences after learning about his studies. Some recalled strange moments from childhood. Others started to view grief in a new light. But what truly changed was the way they began to face their own aging. Today, as we recall this interview, we're not just listening to a researcher. We're coming into contact with decades of accounts that challenge everything we've been taught about the soul. What you're about to hear isn't a religious belief, nor a comforting fable. It's a record made with responsibility, one that connects with something deep within us. Even if you don't believe, it's worth listening to the very end. There are questions that only arise when we're ready, and perhaps, at this stage of life, it's time to ask the right questions. What would you do if you discovered that this life is just one chapter, and that the story doesn't end with the last heartbeat? The answer may not be simple, but the search for it begins now. Stevenson began his search in countries where reincarnation was part of the culture, like India, Sri Lanka, and Lebanon. He knew that in these places, families were less resistant to reporting such memories. However, he went further. He also found cases in the United States, Canada, and Europe, within families without any spiritual beliefs. The most intriguing aspect was that even without a religious context, the children had precise memories of another life. And what's more, these memories were accompanied by strong emotions, such as longing, fear, or anger. Stevenson wrote everything down, compared records, and cross-referenced data. It was slow, meticulous, almost solitary work, but he knew he was dealing with something much greater than simple children's accounts. He was facing a phenomenon that challenged medicine and the very science of the mind. In many interviews, Stevenson highlighted that not all memories were pleasant. There were cases of violent deaths, fatal accidents, and unresolved stories. The children often expressed discomfort, as if carrying traumas that didn't belong to their current life. A boy in the United States claimed to have died in a fire. He had an extreme fear of kitchens, avoided matches, and cried at the sight of bonfires. Upon investigation, Stevenson found records of a tragic fire in the mentioned city, with details the child could never have known. This led the researcher to consider the possibility that certain phobias, birthmarks, or emotional tendencies might be linked to past lives. The human mind, to him, was a bridge, and this bridge could hold much more than recent memories. The interview you're about to hear was recorded at a time of great reflection in Stevenson's life. Already retired, he spoke with more freedom, less fear of academic criticism. In the conversation, he commented that his greatest frustration was not the resistance of science, but the silence of so many who felt something similar and never had the courage to speak. Stevenson believed that older adults had much to contribute to this debate, as they carried a broader view of life. He used to say that as they aged, many began to perceive signs, patterns, or intuitions they couldn't explain, and it was precisely at this stage that an interest in reincarnation became more natural, almost inevitable. The interview, therefore, is also an invitation to inner listening, to the rediscovery of memories that perhaps were always there. Throughout the recording, Stevenson also recounts how he dealt with skepticism. He wasn't aggressive, nor did he try to convince. He simply asked that the data be analyzed with the same rigor as any other study. He presented photos, dates, names, and independent accounts. Many colleagues began to admit that, even if they didn't believe, they had no plausible alternative explanations. This, for him, was already an achievement. The idea wasn't to win a debate, but to broaden horizons. When asked what he personally believed, Stevenson responded calmly. He wasn't certain, but he trusted the facts. And the facts pointed to something that deserved attention. He believed that older adults, more than anyone, had the right to know that perhaps life doesn't end with the last breath. A curious detail is that Stevenson corresponded with older adults worldwide. Many wrote letters recounting experiences they had kept hidden for fear of being ridiculed. Others reported recurrent dreams of places they'd never visited, or feelings of familiarity with unknown people. He read each letter carefully and always responded, even if it was just to say, "Thank you." This exchange strengthened him, as it showed that the phenomenon wasn't limited to children. It was also present in adults, especially those who had gone through traumas, losses, or near-death experiences. Stevenson saw in old age not an end, but an opening, a phase where the invisible began to become more present, and where silence often hid profound revelations. Another striking aspect of this interview is the way he speaks about time. For Stevenson, time was not a straight line. He said that the past, present, and future might be more intertwined than we can understand. Therefore, some memories might not come from childhood, but from much earlier. This idea, though challenging, can bring comfort to those who feel they carry something they cannot name. Stevenson didn't see this as superstition, but as a legitimate field of investigation. For him, science had an obligation to listen to these accounts, even if it didn't yet know how to explain them. And we, as listeners, have the chance to look at these stories with respect and curiosity. Not to accept everything without questioning, but to open up to possibilities that once seemed impossible. In a moving part of the interview, Stevenson recounts the case of a 68-year-old gentleman who, after heart surgery, began to have vivid memories of a past life as a fisherman in Greece. He described with precision the harbor, the boats, the smell of the sea, and even how he handled the caught fish. He had never left the United States. Intrigued, the man wrote to Stevenson. The researcher investigated and found records of a man with that profile who had died at sea 40 years earlier. Most striking was that upon seeing photos of the location, the older man recognized architectural details that had changed over the years. The memory seemed to come from something deeper than imagination. This case made Stevenson believe that memories of past lives were not limited to childhood, but could emerge at any stage of life, especially when the body undergoes liminal experiences. Another case cited involves an American woman who, during hypnosis sessions to treat anxiety, began to describe a life as a nurse during World War I. She had no prior knowledge of detailed historical events, but mentioned names of battles, medications used at the time, and care techniques that had already fallen into disuse. The therapist, initially skeptical, recorded everything and sent the data to Stevenson. He cross-referenced the information and once again found coincidences too strong to ignore. For Stevenson, these accounts didn't prove a definitive truth, but indicated that human consciousness could access memories that surpassed the limits of birth. This led him to consider that perhaps the soul continuously records experiences even when changing bodies, contexts, or cultures. During the interview, Stevenson reflects on the importance of listening carefully to what others consider delusion. Often, he said, the most absurd accounts hide the deepest truths. He recounted that once he was sought out by an elderly lady who claimed to hear an old song as she fell asleep, in a language she didn't know. She recorded the melody, and Stevenson was able to identify the language as Tamil, spoken in southern India. Upon further investigation, he discovered that the lyrics spoke of wartime farewells, corresponding exactly to the theme that caused recurrent anguish in the patient. Stevenson never visited her personally, but he used this example to show that the mind, when freed from rational filters, can access memories we carry unknowingly, and that this wasn't madness, but perhaps a call to recognize who we once were. This view was revolutionary. Instead of dismissing these experiences as daydreams, Stevenson embraced them as clues. He didn't romanticize reincarnation. On the contrary, he said it wasn't always comforting to think we might return. Sometimes the emotional imprints of other lives seem to influence choices, fears, and patterns that people couldn't change. For him, understanding reincarnation could help in freeing oneself from these cycles. Older adults, in particular, could use this understanding to view their journeys with more compassion. If certain pains or challenges came from before, perhaps they weren't fault, but part of a greater learning. And recognizing this could lighten the burden many carry without understanding. The interview shows Stevenson as someone sensible, serene, and profoundly humane, more concerned with bringing relief than answers. Another strong point of the interview is when Stevenson talks about regrets. He said that many older adults carry unanswered questions, incomplete memories, and a feeling that something was missing. For him, understanding the possibility of multiple lives could give new meaning to these gaps. If there wasn't time to fulfill a dream, perhaps it wasn't the end. If there was no reconciliation, perhaps there's still an opportunity. This view, not as an escape but as a possibility, brought comfort to many who heard his words, and this was reflected in the eyes of those who listened. Stevenson never promised reunions, but he made room for each person to find their own way of dealing with the mystery. And above all, he reinforced the importance of living the present with more awareness, for each experience may be building not only the now but something yet to come. Stevenson is asked what he would say to someone who is afraid of death. He responds with simplicity. That fear comes from the unknown, and that when we face it head-on, what seemed like darkness begins to show shapes. He says that if there is something afterwards, perhaps we won't be strangers on that path. Perhaps what we have already lived is preparing us for something larger, broader. He recalls a phrase he heard from a Buddhist monk: "He who fears death fears life." Stevenson agreed, for he saw that the fear of dying often hid a greater fear, that of not having lived as one wished. And that's where he insisted most. Live with truth, with presence. What comes after doesn't belong to us now, but the now can be lived with courage, and that in itself is a form of preparation. Throughout his life, Ian Stevenson faced criticism, distrust, and even academic isolation, but he never abandoned his ethics. He continued researching until the end, maintaining a silent commitment to those who entrusted him with their stories. He didn't seek fame or prestige. He simply wanted to understand, with honesty, what seemed to defy known laws. He used to say that it wasn't about convincing anyone to believe in reincarnation, but rather about recognizing that there are real phenomena experienced by ordinary people that deserve attention and respect. And this is especially true for those who, upon reaching old age, begin to remember details that don't make sense, but which insist on appearing. Sometimes what we call forgetting may, in fact, be the doorway to memories that have waited a lifetime to emerge. Stevenson also spoke about the importance of listening. He recounted that many older adults felt ashamed to remember something that seemed out of place. But when they found someone willing to listen without judgment, these memories gained shape and meaning. Therefore, he encouraged families not to disregard the accounts of grandparents or parents who, as they aged, began to mention unknown names, places, or situations. For him, respect for these stories was more important than proving any theory, and often this acceptance was enough for people to find peace. He believed that by listening attentively to others, we build bridges between lives, between generations, between worlds. And these bridges, even invisible, sustain something essential in the human journey, the desire for continuity. At the end of the interview, Stevenson leaves a clear message. He says that we don't know for sure what exists after death, but that we have enough evidence to consider that life might continue in another form. Not as a repetition, but as a continuity that escapes our understanding. He asks people not to be afraid to ask questions, nor ashamed to remember. He says that everything we are might be connected to something larger, older, deeper, and that this connection can be felt in small details, a smell, a dream, a longing that we don't know where it comes from. For him, age doesn't matter. There is always time to discover. There is always room to reflect. There is always a moment when the soul decides to speak, even if in silence. The interview ends with a long pause where Stevenson takes a deep breath before expressing his thanks. He thanks not only for the listening, but for the chance to have contributed something he considers valuable. He says that if even one person feels less alone upon hearing his words, it will have been worth it. It's a simple conclusion, yet loaded with meaning. He promises nothing, affirms nothing, he merely shares. And perhaps that's the most important thing. In times when so many speak too much, there is something powerful in someone who chooses to speak only what is necessary. And Stevenson did this with mastery. He left a legacy that still echoes today among those seeking answers, and which may be especially valuable to you who have come this far, seeking more than explanations, seeking meaning. If you've listened this far, perhaps you've already felt something different. Maybe a memory has surfaced or a new thought has formed. This happens when we touch on topics that speak directly to the heart. Your belief, your history, or your doubts don't matter. What matters is being open to looking beyond. And if there's one thing this interview teaches us, it's that looking beyond doesn't require blind faith, but the courage to question. And if at this moment in life you feel closer to some answers, know that it's never too late to start asking new questions. Time may pass, the body may age, but consciousness remains present, active, curious. And perhaps it is consciousness itself that most desires you to listen to what it has always tried to tell you. If this content has touched you in any way, please share it with someone who deserves to hear these words. Sometimes a simple conversation can change the course of a life. And if you feel this channel helps you to reflect, subscribe. We are here to listen, embrace, and walk together on this journey of discovery. Ian Stevenson left us a path, but it's up to us to decide whether or not to follow it. The important thing is not to let fear silence the desire to know more, because as long as there is curiosity, there will be hope, and as long as there is hope, it will never be the end.